Magazine. Today we have with us Volodymyr Ishchenko, author of many articles on Ukraine and the Ukraine-Russia war, recently compiled into a book by Verso called Towards the Abyss, with a new introduction, which is a very interesting book to read. And he's today here to talk a bit about this book. So normally I begin these interviews of questions with the question of who you are, what drives your research, and in your case, the book Beyond the Abyss. You pretty much answer that question, stating your first chapter introduction, defining yourself as a Soviet Ukrainian. And to start off, I don't know if you want to elaborate on these things. What do you mean by Soviet Ukrainian in particular?
Yeah, thank you for having me. And the book is actually called Towards the Abyss, and it tells a lot about how I view the trajectory of Ukraine. The Soviet Ukrainian is actually an identity concept that has a lot to do with the general idea of the book. Well, we can start. We can think about this as an attempt to understand the notorious so-called regional cleavage in Ukraine, which so many people, not only beyond Ukraine but also within Ukraine as well, have been so much obsessed with. And quite many people understood it as kind of like almost an ethnic conflict. Like, for example, Russian speakers against Ukrainian speakers, Eastern regions against the Western regions, and so on and so forth. I suggest to look at this through the perspective of the social revolution and class dynamics. So one very important fact that perhaps for most of Ukrainians, the rise of the national consciousness and the social revolution, specifically the revolution which the Bolsheviks started and then which continued in the Soviet Union, these two processes were intertwined. So the people were becoming Ukrainians and they were becoming at the same time Soviet at the same time. And in the process of that revolution, because it had enormous bloody consequences, and there's no even need to remind about some of the horrors of Stalinism. At the same time, this was a modernization process for the majority of the population, not only Ukraine, but in most parts of the Soviet Union. And in the introduction to the book, in the preface, I actually describe kind of like the national history, but also the history of my family, of the social advancement in a very rapid tempo in a short period of time. The advancements from quite low ranks in the society, workers, peasants, to the elite intellectuals who, like in the case of my family, who were working on some of the cutting-edge problems in the cosmonautics, in the cybernetics, and were directly involved into the most advanced spheres of the Soviet development. And of course, this had a profound effect on how we think about the history of Ukraine, and then also about the current affairs. How those achievements of the Soviet Ukraine were disintegrating, degenerating, collapsing, consciously destroyed, consciously silenced, and as it was escalating in the recent years, but obviously starting much earlier, not even with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but even earlier, I would say. Some of the first signs were already in the 1960s. And at this moment, Soviet Ukrainian is also is a look into the past, is a way to understand uh, my own experience and the experience of the Ukrainians like me, and to in a way to kind of like to think about the problem of how we of the problem of profound crisis, profound crisis in many spheres, but fundamentally the crisis of collective action, how we became atomized, how we became divided by the front line, divided by the political positions, and what are we going to do next, and how we lost that kind of Ukraine, which made such an enormous breakthrough in the Soviet period, and now is descending into such horrors as we observe right now. And obviously, this is not just the history about Ukraine. This is a history about Russia, about the whole Soviet and post-Soviet space.
Right. This is you mentioned the fact that you became Soviet and Ukraine at the same time is kind of characteristic of the USSR. We saw it in not only, I guess, in Belarus and Ukraine, but also in the Central Asian republics, right, which are basically almost created by the Soviet Union. So you mentioned the 60s very briefly, but so you say there was an arc of atomization. What really happens, after the collapse of the Soviet Union? Because you start your book when you talk about Euromaidan, but there's 20 years between Euromaidan and 1991, right, where Ukrainians had voted with some or less abstention for independence from the Soviet Union. So can you maybe elaborate a bit on what you said of individualization and the failure of the project before we
Well,
talk
it's
about
actually
2014?
the events of 2014 and the events of 2022 as well. They help us to understand what was exactly that period. And my argument is that this is the period of the permanent crisis. This argument, of course, is in polemics with quite like two dominant interpretations of the post-Soviet period. One of them, which was like immediately emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this was a paradigm of democratization. So there were expectations that the post-Soviet nations are going to become something like Western liberal democracies. Quite soon, that expectation proved to be false. Although now it's kind of like resurgent, and in this kind of like a way of teleological look into the post-Soviet history, one could interpret that right now in Ukraine, this is still this fight, this like existential struggle of democracy against dictatorship. And when Ukraine wins, this would be like another step towards ultimate progress of liberal democratization. An alternative narrative appeared a bit later, and which focused on Russia, on Belarus, and was looking at the post-Soviet developments as a kind of like consolidation of authoritarian regimes. So the post-Soviet developments were not about democratization; they were actually about building the regimes like Putin's. And if you look at on Ukraine from this perspective, it would look like as a deficient authoritarianism. So the people, the presidents like Leonid Kuchma in the 1990s, or Viktor Yanukovych in the first half of 2010s, they were trying to build an authoritarian regime, but they failed. And the Orange Revolution in 2004 and the Euromaidan revolution in 2014, they prevented the consolidation of authoritarianism, although it doesn't mean that they actually built democracies, because that requires a bit more. And my argument, which also others interesting scholars share, is that perhaps it's neither linear development to democratization or nor the development to authoritarianism, but we've been living through at least 30 years of permanent crisis. This crisis had roots in the degeneration of the Soviet Revolution, when the communist hegemonic apparatus collapsed. It left just a huge void of political and social institutions, which have not been filled by any comparable stable structures since the 30 years of the post-Soviet changes. And the Maidan revolutions in Ukraine, they are in a certain way a manifestation, but also reproduction of this crisis. But at the same time, the regimes like Putin, at least for most of the period of their development, may not necessarily build the proper stable structures. There's a very interesting book by Timothy Fry, an American political scientist, which is called Weak Strongman. So Putin tries to be a strongman, but there are many contradictions within his regime, and very interesting how in that book the almost each chapter ends with kind of like a warning. So Putin's regime is kind of like entering kind of like a critical period when something new may start. And we could also think that, at least this is my argument, that we could think about the Russian invasion of Ukraine as an escalation of the same post-Soviet crisis, which, however, may create such severe challenges for Putin's regime that it may require this regime to transform into something different.
So to begin to break this apart, so when you look at Maidan, people think of it in very binary terms, like it's either everything is great or everything is against. But one of the things I read in your book, which struck me, is the fact that you said there were progressive elements in Maidan and there were progressive elements in the anti-Maidan forces. Can you maybe talk a bit about because we talked about the failure of the project of Ukraine and failure to become soft authoritarianism, but what do you think was the positive project of Ukraine, the one that you said was present in shadows in mainly both sides of the Maidan split, and why this project?
Well, I wouldn't say there was a positive project in a proper sense of a project, of a developed program, of some articulated ideology. My argument in the period when I wrote about this possibility, or maybe even wishful thinking about consolidation of progressive wings of Maidan and anti-Maidan protests, were that in both of the movements, if you even can call them movements, in both of the milieus at least, there were people who understood the restrictions, the contradictions, the problems of both protests. And they were understanding that there are quite reactionary forces on the both sides. And they were trying to articulate some progressive demands within those protests. So there were indeed some small left-wing groups in Euromaidan, There were also the left which joined anti-Maidan movement, and in certain places they actually played a considerably bigger role than, for example, Russian nationalists. But nevertheless, those protests were overtaken by the incursion of Igor Strelkov group, and then overtaken by Russia. To cut a long story short, and so that expectations didn't become true, but those essays, and that's also perhaps important to remind that this is not a monograph, this is a collection of my essays throughout 10 years. They articulated this as a possible, let's say, positive development, which was at least thinkable in 2014. However, I didn't realize, and perhaps there were objective reasons why I didn't realize. And right now, I mean, you started this question of that some people think about Euromaidan in kind of like in black and white perspective. I would say even before the invasion, even let's say in 2021, even within Ukraine, most people would not think about that in a black and white terms. If you look at the public opinion surveys, until the moment when they started to lose their reliability with the start of the invasion, but in 2021, we would find about 40% of Ukrainians that who would still say that they would support Euromaidan. Let's think about, imagine you are back in 2014. Would you support Euromaidan or not? And no, about 40% would say yes. And actually, a plurality would say they would not support either side. Only even smaller minority would say they would support anti-Maidan or Russia, whatever. The plurality were skeptical about that because they understood the disastrous consequences after that, after the revolution, and they didn't see much of positive developments that would justify all the destruction and suffering, which was already happening even before the invasion. As a result of the war in Donbass and the quite negative developments in politics and economics. So for the plurality of Ukrainians, that did not have much of the positive value. Although it didn't mean that they would support Putin or they would have any nostalgia for Yanukovych. And when we speak about these distributions in the service, we need to remember that practically all of the surveys which were conducted in Ukraine since 2014 did not include Crimea and the eastern part of Donbass. So officially, Ukraine never reneged on these territories and on those people. However, in the conduct of the public opinion service, the opinions of those people who were, for many reasons, significantly more pro-Russian and anti-Maidan, however, they were not included into the figures that were typically distributed and were also used for political purposes. So in reality, if you think about those several million of Ukrainian citizens, the number of 40% in support of Maidan was in reality even less.
So maybe I think the view we get from the West is, something's a very different one. Of course, they will tell us what we want to hear, especially now, I guess. But before 2022, you never got, you also didn't really question what you were hearing out of the time. So maybe one topic which is particularly contentious is, the role of the far right. You mentioned how, it's far from hegemonic, even if it has its proportionate influence. What exactly is the position of the far right here? Because some every now and then you see on social media this picture of Black Sun or whatever, and then you have the people taking the line that everybody's a Nazi, which is probably not true. But at the same time, it does bother a lot of people that even just for the sake of it, people are taking up this imagery of Stefan Bandera and other people and saying like, "Oh, these are Ukrainian heroes." So, what do you make of
Well,
all of this?
again, I'll also start with the assumption that this is kind of like a super controversial topic. Again, before the invasion, when with on the 24th of February 2022, the political climate changed drastically, and many of the topics and many of the discussions became taboo. But before that, again, even within Ukraine, there was actually much more open discussion about the presence and the danger of the Ukrainian radical nationalists. And I mean, even the people who in 2014 were so kind of like involved into what they believe to be, if you take them with a good face. So kind of like they were trying to counter Putin's narratives about the fascist junta in Ukraine, about the Ukrainian Nazis on Euromaidan. And so they were emphasizing that Euromaidan was a diverse movement, that radical nationalists were only a small minority there, which was true. That most Ukrainians are not necessarily supporting them, and so on and so on and so forth. I mean, even many of these kind of people were seeing that well, radical nationalists might not win the elections. However, it's just ridiculous to think about political struggle only in terms of the elections, especially in the countries like Ukraine, with a weak state capacity, with very turbulent politics, in the country where 3 revolutions happened in the life of just one generation. Try to find any other country in the earth with such frequency of revolutions. Right, and then if revolutions, if contentious politics are so important in the history of this country, and the current politics, are you serious about elections? And that's and when the radical nationalists cannot poll more than like 5%, it means that so much more is completely irrelevant. And think about Donald Trump, think about Marine Le Pen, think about alternative for Germany, and the rise of the right-wing populist forces. And we do not see something like this in Ukraine. So what are you even talking about? Just open your eyes and start look at Ukrainian politics in real terms. So despite the radical nationalists were a minority among the Euromaidan protesters, they never polled a majority. Although again, in the pre-Euromaidan history, the Far Right Svoboda Party actually got majorities in a number of regions of Ukraine, especially in the western regions. And in 2012, they won over 10% of the national vote, so not something insignificant. Still, yes, after the Euromaidan, they didn't even get into the parliament. However, we had quite an extraordinary thing like Azov movement, a military unit plus paramilitaries plus intellectuals plus summer camps. So kind of like an infrastructure of the far right, which was looking more like the 1930s than the contemporary right-wing populists in Europe, and with connections with pretty extreme groups in the Western Europe, which were also for a certain period of time were interested to come to Ukraine, to join Azov, to get military experience. And these kind of things were becoming more and more evident. And before the invasion, there were like massive publications in the Western press about Azov, about other Ukrainian far right, and there was an understanding these guys are dangerous, and they did have some political influence. Let me remind you, for example, so before 2019 elections, and especially before Zelensky decided to run in those elections. So there was an expectation then that it would be Poroshenko, the incumbent president, against, for example, Yulia Tymoshenko, who is also kind of like a veteran of Ukrainian politics, or a kind of, in quotes, Russian candidate, Yuri Boyko. So that would be another competition of the oligarchic politicians. And there were real expectations that the far right, and specifically Azov, may disrupt the elections, and that they may tilt the outcomes in favor of this or that candidate. Specifically, there were expectations that they may be anti-Poroshenko. And Azov actually actively campaigned against Poroshenko on the eve of 2019 elections. And so not just like some radical left, but ambassadors of G7 nations. So ambassadors of the most powerful nations in the world, they were writing an official letter to the Minister of Interior, Arsen Avakov, who was believed to be kind of like in informal support of Azov. So they warned him that they are very much disturbed and they're very much concerned about possible impact of the far-right radicals. So, I mean, if that was recognized as a serious problem on the level of G7 ambassadors, was it a problem or not? And are we now serious when we just bluntly deny that this was a problem and this is still a problem? Again, according to to Ukrainian press, actually, not according to any kind of pro-Russian propaganda, but according to Ukrainian media, when Zelensky decided to ballot, G7 ambassadors met him. And one of the questions to him was, okay, Volodymyr Zelensky, you say you are going to negotiate about Donbass with Putin, but what are you going to do with the far right if they are not going to recognize your decisions or negotiations? And this is a question from one of the ambassadors. Zelensky didn't know what to answer. And of course, the far right played an important role why the Minsk Accords were not implemented. And yeah, in so-called anti-capitulation campaign in 2019, specifically against the implementation of the Minsk Accords. So they played an important role. And now, of course, I mean, the popularity of this Nazi symbolics among the Ukrainian soldiers, it does not necessarily say that these are, let's say, ideological national socialists or defense of Hitler. Not necessarily. Yes. So if one want to make an argument that these are kind of like Nazi partisans, not necessarily, and well, we can think about some explanation if Russians are so much obsessed with Ukrainian Nazis. Okay, we'll try to kind of like to make them angry, but this is not a justification. When these symbols are becoming so much mainstream, this is a problem. And there should be a space and there should be a perspective how to voice this problem, how that it should not be denied, it should be recognized, it should be also, there should be some action about this. And simply silencing this, simply saying that it's justifying it, reducing it to Russian propaganda, it just makes all these things only worse. However, this happens, and this is kind of like, I mean, immediately after the invasion started, this topic of the discussion of Azov became super taboo. I mean, some journalists were still trying to raise this problem. However, I recall a great article in I think in the Forward newspaper in the United States, which I believe is a Jewish left-wing outlet by Lev Galinkin, who is a journalist also with some Ukrainian roots. And he reminded, okay, New York Times, the Washington Post, the Times, practically all of the mainstream Western newspapers before the invasion, they wrote about Azov as neo-Nazis, or at least as a unit with some serious far-right elements. And they stopped to write about this completely after the invasion started. What happened? And we know that there was no real depoliticization of Azov. We know that the people who started the unit, they still are on the commanding positions in the specifically in the 3rd Assault Brigade, which developed from Azov, and it is commanded by the same Andrei Beletsky, the neo-Nazi who started Azov battalion in 2014. Now he's the commander of the brigade, and now this brigade fought in Bakhmut, and now, according to the recent media reports, they're allocated to Avdiivka, where another major battle is happening right now. So, and it looks like this is an important brigade, and some believe this is one of the most combat-ready brigades, considered to be even an elite brigade. I don't know. I'm not a military analyst. I really cannot make an expert opinion on this, but quite a considerable number of analysts and journalists are pointing to this. And okay, and if you have one of the most combat-ready brigades in the Ukrainian armed forces under command of committed far-right activists, is this a problem or not? So I think it's a problem, and we need to have a free space to debate this, at the very least.
Right, I see the double bind, right? It's the thing you mentioned about Trump and the far right in Europe is a good point, right? It's not like people here they have their hands clean by any means. And anyway, so one thing I wanted to ask is, do you think things could have been done differently? Like you detail, like you said earlier, your book is kind of a collection of articles across time, which is very useful because sometimes if you don't have this sense of predestination, if you write a book in 2024, of course it will talk about 2022 as if something is unavoidable, or it will have the Owl of Minerva. But in the run-up to the war, do you think things could have been done differently, or there was simply too much revanchism from both sides, or from any side?
Obviously, there were some objective causes of the war. So, but at the same time, I don't think the war was inevitable. My colleague and co-author Oleg Zhuravlev, who is a Russian sociologist, now he's in Italy, and his group conducted a big number of interviews with ordinary Russians, what they think about the war, with supporters of the war, with some of the opponents, with those who basically don't care. And what he analyzes are so-called narratives of inevitability. How even the people who were completely surprised with the start of the war in February, March 2022, later are starting to construct kind of like rationalization narratives. The war was inevitable. Yeah, the war is bad, the people are dying, and maybe when Russian army is doing something wrong, we are speaking about Russian citizens. But the war was allegedly inevitable. And in the, let's say, speaking about Russians, of course, it's much easier to question this inevitability. They attacked Ukraine, right? So, but is it also impossible to think about the same kind of like inevitability rationalizations also from Ukrainian side? Why exactly the Minsk Accords were not implemented? And of course, many people think about them as a kind of like a Trojan horse of Russia that would be capitulation for Ukraine, but capitulation for which exactly groups and classes in Ukraine. And there is also a very interesting study by Peter Korotayev, who is a junior researcher, also with some Ukrainian roots. And he studied, for example, how the most important liberal outlet, Ukrainian Truth, discussed the Minsk Accords since 2015. And he finds like a number of significant publications, basically the mainstream line of the people writing for this paper. And these are liberals, these are not far right, this is not radical nationalists, it's liberal intellectuals, liberal journalists, and how they were super critical against the Minsk Accords. And they were critical against the Minsk Accords precisely because they were thinking about that would force Ukraine to renege on the pro-Western development course, on the European integration, on NATO, and that would incorporate back all those Vatnik separatists in Donbass who would only kind of like prevent the pro-Western movement of Ukraine. Why do we even need those people? This was explicitly said by some of the most educated, most enlightened people in Ukraine. And this was in their class interests. These were the people who would benefit the most from the EU integration or in general pro-Western integration of Ukraine. And they didn't need those people who were thinking differently about this. And they were thinking differently, not because of the pro-Russian propaganda, but because of their material interests, which were not aligned with the neoliberal pro-Western development that the professional middle class were so much supporting. So do we need to have this discussion and to question these inevitability narratives that Ukraine couldn't do anything else but just wait for the invasion or prepare for it better? No, I think there were alternative points, there were alternative roads to take. And now we need to study, now we need to have a discussion about why they were not taken.
So how do you, so one big difference between, I think, and you've written about this, is how Ukraine and how Russia are conducting the war, right? In the sense, Russia is going towards a very military Keynesianist character, which you mentioned at some point would completely reshape Russia's productive structure. And you wrote this in late 2022, and things have really gone in that direction. Maybe you can give us an update on the thoughts on the productive character and how that has changed since.
Yeah, I think it's actually a very important question, and we need to think about it not only in the context of Russia, but for example, when in the context of the current debate in the United States about the weapons and support for Ukraine and allocating money. One of the major arguments that Biden's administration, Democrats are making, that this is actually money not exactly for Ukraine, but in order to support, to pay to the American producers of weapons. They're not even going to Ukraine. They're staying in the United States, and they would benefit American workers. Does it sound like military Keynesianism? It sounds quite a lot. Or very recent news from France. They also kind of like, there's a discussion of whether the European Union can buy weapons for Ukraine outside of the EU. and France is not happy about this decision, and they would like to have this money within the European Union, within France, that French producers of weapons would benefit from that. And this is also pretty similar to military keynesianism. And in case of Russia, the Soviet, this is, we started this the conversation with the Soviet Union, with the Soviet development. The Soviet Union had a massive military industrial complex, and Russia preserved quite large part of it. And now it starts to work in the context of the full-scale war, and that legacy that was built by the Soviet workers, also kind of like in order to fight the existential threat from Nazi Germany, and later in the context of the Cold War, now it works for Russian warfare right now, and start to have some of the effects not only on the military production but also on the civilian production. So the general increase of the wages, because if so many workers are invited to work in the military factories and they are offered very good wages, it means also that the civilian sectors need to increase wages in order to compete for the labor force. And this has a further kind of like positive feedback loop for the whole economy. And we also see in the economic statistics that Russia actually grows better than the Western countries. So the Western countries which impose sanctions on Russia are performing worse economically, with less than average, which is a very kind of like unexpected and counterintuitive development. And even more so, the rich in Russia are becoming even more richer. So at the beginning of the war, there were actually the quite widespread expectations that the elite in Russia would conspire against Putin because they've just lost their villas, their Western bank accounts because of the sanctions, some of the production links. However, this didn't come true, and this didn't come true for a very good reason. Some of them lost, but on average, we see in the wealth reports, in Bloomberg ratings, that the Russian oligarchs only become richer because of the war. This war is going on in their interests. And a number of Putin cronies have acquired the Western corporations' assets, those corporations that decided to leave Russia after the sanctions were imposed, and they acquired them basically for pennies in many cases, and they become immensely rich because of that. So that's how it works. And well, there are in the most recent analysis that we wrote together with my Russian colleagues Ilya Matveyev and Oleg Zhuravlev. We also pointed to some of the contradictions of the military keynesianism. For example, one of the most important is inflation. And there are groups in the society who receive bigger wages. However, there are also other groups who suffer from increased prices. However, they didn't get such comparable increase of their wages, and so they look at the economic developments in a much more pessimistic perspective. But at the same time, we do find, for example, in the interviews with Russians, the people who were initially skeptical about the war, didn't support it, but then their life became better. They found a better job. They were started to receive better payment, and they started to be much more pro-war as a result. pro-governmental, and they started to connect the interests of themselves and their families with the interests of the state. And this is very interesting development, thinking about it. Post-Soviet crisis, which is fundamentally the crisis of disconnection between the society and politics, where these are basically almost like two separate worlds. And in the military Keynesianism, if it's going to be sustainable for a long period of time, and I acknowledge there are many arguments that may put under risk these policies. But if it may work for considerable period of time, if Russia is not losing the war, we might see a significant part of the society that might think about the war as something that is done in their own interest, kind of like well, something comparable to that classical labor aristocracy that Lenin analyzed in case of Britain, a part of the working class who like directly materially benefited from the colonial exploitation of the colonies in Africa and Asia.
Right, because in the end, Keynesianism did stop working in the West at some point. So, like you said, they had the problems, inflation, and lack of productive investment. Even and another point you raised is like, yeah, the West still does it. It's just not helping develop Ukraine in a sense. It's just like putting up its own industry. So, before we begin to wrap up, you talk about one chapter in the book about Belarus and the Belarusian protest of 2020. In a sense, Belarus is like it almost occupies the same position in the post-Soviet sphere. Can you maybe tease out the differences between Belarus and Ukraine? And you say like you can learn about Ukraine by looking at Belarus, and you can learn about Belarus by looking at Ukraine.
Well, that comparison, of course, is very instructive, and not only about differences, also the similarities. And one of the arguments which became kind of like more clear to me since the invasion, that's actually the main conflicts in Ukraine and Belarus and also in Russia actually the same, and they have the same class base. This is fundamentally the conflict of the ruling class of so-called political capitalists in the post-Soviet space against the professional middle classes allied with transnational capital. And in cases of today Navalny is dead. In cases of the protest of the Russian opposition, in case of the Belarusian uprising in 2020, and in case of the Ukrainian Maidan revolutions, these are fundamentally the same conflict. It has some national specifics, it has some local articulations, but fundamentally these are the same class forces that are standing behind it. And so, but the development of this conflict, in case of Ukraine and Belarus, went in obviously different way. And in Ukraine, we had, as I said, like 3 successful revolutions, successful at least in the sense of overthrowing the government, not necessarily in the movement to some socially progressive changes. But in Belarus, we had a very coercive response by the government that succeeded in repression of the protests. And why it didn't happen? That's, again, for example, that says a lot about how the elites are structured in Ukraine and Belarus, why elites were so much more consolidated around Lukashenko, and didn't show any signs of significant splits, despite very massive protests, and which actually goes against some of the mainstream political science theories, basically claiming that when we have at least 3% of the mobilization of the population coming to the streets in the oppositional protests, it basically means that the government is doomed. In Belarus, we had something about 3%, but of course the measurement of the number of protesters is not exactly reliable. But still, there were massive protests, but the police structure, the elite groups were not leaving Lukashenko. But in case of Ukraine, they left Yanukovych just in 3 months after the protest. Or again, we were speaking about the role of the far right, and Belarus actually shows that how important was that violent vanguard in the Euromaidan protest. In case of Belarus, after the first initial 2 or 3 nights of some violence, which was kind of like successfully counteracted by the Belarusian police, the protest went into completely non-violent development afterwards, and it showed that actually that when the government and the elites are consolidated, they can simply wait when that wave of non-violent protests would just evaporate. And with gradual intensification of repression, they solved the problem. In case of Ukraine, it didn't work like that. And in case of Ukraine, there was this violent vanguard, which was actually preparing for the violent revolution since 1990s. They were thinking about the need for so-called national revolution. They were understanding this revolution as a violent revolution, and they were preparing for it. And when the right moment came in 2014, they were at the right place. And we even had like in the book that we were working on even before the invasion, we had like even statistical model showing that the presence of the far right radicals made the made the events or in Euromaidan much more violent.
So let me ask you one more question before I let you go. Like, your book in a way represents a, privileged look. Like I said, it's a temporal span of articles. And in what ways do you notice maybe your thinking has changed throughout the last 10 years? And, what are your outlooks for the future? Because you say like the certain Ukraine, which you thought was your country, in a way no longer exists. So what is what is the role of time to say in a way, how has your thinking changed and what do you see the things going now?
Yeah, well, this is a kind of like, especially the last one, a difficult question. But how my thinking has changed. One of the things that I now understand better, or I believe I understand better than in 2014, is actually the class component of the whole conflict. And specifically how it played out in the allegedly regional differences. The differences exist, however, what stands behind them, and the fact that so-called pro-Western and so-called pro-Russian political camps in Ukraine have been often perceived as kind of like symmetrical, and they actually look kind of like symmetrical on the electoral maps. However, if you look beyond the maps, at the social structure and the class forces standing behind those camps, you would see a huge asymmetry. The much bigger support of the professional middle classes for the pro-Western camp, much more passive, although electorally very significant, and sometimes actually electoral majorities voting for supposedly pro-Russian candidates. However, the majorities that were not capable to organize their own civil society, their own massive movements, and to have a comparable influence on the politics. Again, going back to those discussions about elections or street politics, the power of non-electoral politics should not be underestimated. In the case of Ukraine, it's kind of like it's fundamental if you want to understand anything about Ukrainian politics. So that asymmetry behind seemingly symmetrical regional camps, that was something that became clear on the eve of the elections, of the invasion in 2022 and right after, and thinking about Ukrainian politics also in the context of post-Soviet and as a part of the much longer historical process of Soviet and post-Soviet hegemony crisis. That things are later developments. And yeah, and this lives with this situation of the atomization of problems with collective action, problems of, I mean, yeah, we started to discuss about the Soviet Ukrainians starting to speak to each other, to articulate collective problems, how we are going to relate to what's happening now, and how our country that we were born in, yeah, perhaps doesn't exist anymore. And that was one of my first thoughts on February 24, that perhaps I don't have a homeland anymore. Well, however this war is going to end, whoever is going to win, those changes would be so big that that may not necessarily leave a space for the people like me. But yeah, that's the history is not. It's not the end of the history, and we need, of course, to look how it's going on. And one of the conclusions that were also tried to articulate in the introduction, the preface to the book, was thinking about progressive politics and revolutionary politics is beyond the national boundaries. And we see how the conflict in Ukraine is more and more intertwined with the conflicts in other parts of the world, in the Middle East, in Taiwan. If something is going to happen between Venezuela and Guyana, that would also become a part of that. If something may escalate in Korea, that would also be a part of that. So this may indeed look like as a preparation, as the kind of the first phases of a much more global conflict. And in that perspective, the conflict in Ukraine might be seen completely different. And after that, we might be in a completely different situation. And it also requires us to think about the global, universal solutions for our problems, for our conflicts. And we see how the crisis, I mean, Ukraine is basically is a magnifying glass to many of the global problems. The hegemony crisis, the destructive neoliberalism, the escalation of nationalism and tribalism. We would see this in many parts of the world, and developments in Ukraine actually contributed. We also understand this. They contributed to this regressive, reactionary developments in many other parts of the world as well. We see now how Ukraine became central for the American politics. I mean, the issue of two impeachment cases against two presidents of the United States. Just think about that. And that means, and at the same time, we also see the rise in authoritarian trends. How many previously completely legitimate opinions are becoming more and more taboo, and the people are suffering the ostracism, canceling, they lose jobs, and some even go to go to jail because of that. If you see the escalation of the crisis, if we see the rise of the authoritarianism, we need to come back to the project of the social revolution, something that was kind of on the agenda of the left and kind of in the background. However, I don't think that at least the kind of the mainstream, the most dominant part of the left was taken seriously about it. Many people were thinking about that the left in politics may continue in the framework of the liberal democracies. But what if the liberal democracies are kind of changing into something else? And this requires a complete transformation of how we think about the left in politics right now. And coming back to the social revolutionary project and to the project of how we can conduct revolutionary politics in the contemporary societies.
Well, that's pretty much almost all the questions I had. I don't know if there's something else you'd like to leave us with, or something I didn't ask, and you felt it was appropriate.
Perhaps that's it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for your time again, and yeah, and this was good. I mean, like reading your book, and now the answers to some of the questions really made me think about it. In a way, I sympathize a lot with the idea that you have no homeland left, because I mean, it's not the same case, but where I come from has changed so much in the last 20 years. It really doesn't feel like home anymore. And it's a very weird position to be in, because once you leave a place, you don't change with the place anymore. And I feel that that's something that happens to people who move around a bit.
Yeah, but thank you for this conversation. That also helped me to reflect on some of these things.
Anyway, well, thanks again for your time. And for the listeners, if you like this, go pick up the book. It's very good. I mean, it's very entertaining. It's not very long, and it's an easy read. And tell a friend about it, and